My name is Don Deal, Dr. Don Deal. I practiced here in Springfield in the first half of the last century. As you can tell from looking at me, when I was a physician, we believed it was healthy to eat large amounts of red meat and whole milk, fatty cheese, Lucky Strike cigarettes. That's not fair. Dr. Deal was actually a slender and healthy man. I can't help who I am. I want to warn you that we are going to be talking about blood. And some people are uneasy talking about blood. Makes them feel oogie, medical term. So if you're uneasy talking about blood, I won't be offended if you move on, but I hope that you stay. Who here has ever donated blood? That's good, because donating blood is a very important thing to do. And it's really not very hard. And you just have to take a little needle prick and lay there. And after you're done, you feel like a great humanitarian, because you are a great humanitarian. And they often give you a cookie. Who here has received a blood transfusion? Not very many, and that's a good thing, because if you need blood, chances are you're not in very good shape. And folks who have received transfusions would probably say that if they hadn't gotten blood when they needed it, they might not be here to tell the story. So I was the first physician to successfully perform a blood transfusion here in Southern Illinois. The year was 1914. My patient was Julia Harney. Julia and Henry, her husband, farmed out by Middleton. And Henry brought Julia to St. John's Hospital for surgery to remove a tumor. But Julia had been hemorrhaging, losing blood. She had lost a great deal of blood. She was very weak. She needed the operation, but chances are the operation would have killed her. Julia needed blood. Now, today in 2023, blood transfusions are routine. They happen every day. They happen multiple times every day. But in 1914, to Julia and Henry, this farming couple, the idea of taking blood from one person and giving it to another person must have seemed like science fiction or witchcraft. 1914 was a long time ago. Julia and Henry traveled to Springfield by horse. Their farm didn't have an automobile. Now, there were automobiles in Springfield in 1914, but many people, especially farm people, got around on horses. The Harney farm had no refrigeration. It had no tractor, had no electricity. They didn't even have a pop-up toaster. You know why they didn't have a pop-up toaster? Sliced bread wasn't even invented until 1928. You may be shocked to learn that in 1914, there were no horseshoe sandwiches or mellow cream donuts. Life was rough in 1914. It was the discovery of blood types in 1900 that opened the door to blood transfusions. Who here has type O blood? Negative. O negative. About 40% of the world's population has type O blood. What about type A blood? About a third of the world's population has type A blood. Type B, fairly rare. About 15% of the world's population has type B blood. And type AB blood, very unusual, very rare. Only about 5% of the world's population has type AB blood. Now, this all sounds kind of complicated. I mean, why don't all human beings have the same kind of blood? Well, as it turns out, the different blood types help us fight different infections and different environmental conditions. Type O, for example, resists malaria, also resists COVID-19, by the way. So in parts of the world where it's hot and wet, where mosquitoes thrive and mosquitoes transmit malaria, in hot, wet regions of the world, people tend to have type O blood. In Ecuador, for example, on the equator, mosquitoes, hot, wet, over 75% of the population of the country of Ecuador have type O blood. That's 3 times as many as people in North America. Type O blood is a tremendous advantage to people who live in areas where malaria exists, because people with the other types of blood get sick and die. And over many generations, it's the type O folks that remain. Type B blood, as I said, fairly rare, 15% of the world's population, fairly rare. But if you happen to live in the Himalayan mountains, you're likely to have type B blood. North India, Pakistan, Nepal. We're not sure why, but it probably has something to do with living at altitude. So if your family originated in Pakistan or Nepal or North India, you're more likely to have type B blood. Now, Charles Darwin would say that blood types evolved to help us deal with environmental conditions. The Dalai Lama and Pope Francis would say that blood types are evidence that God works in mysterious ways. And I believe both. I think God works in mysterious ways, and I think evolution helps us cope with environmental conditions. Well, in 1900, we discovered blood types, and by 1914, when I was dealing with Julia, we had a test to show that Henry and Julia had compatible blood types. So a transfusion was theoretically possible, but I still had to convince them that a transfusion was necessary and that it was safe for both of them and that I could do it. I had read about transfusions at big hospitals in big cities, but I had never even seen one performed. Candidly, in many ways, I didn't know what I was doing. Julia and Henry were truly brave pioneers. Henry Harney was a large, powerful man. Out in Middleton, most people called him Big Hank. Now, Big Hank wasn't afraid of very much, but as a farmer, he had seen many animals die of blood loss. He knew that his wife's life was in danger. He was afraid for her. But he also knew that this blood transfusion put his life in my hands. He knew that it was a first for me, for St. John's, for Springfield, for downstate Illinois. Julia and Henry had plenty to be scared of. And I know I was scared. But Henry Harney dearly loved his wife, and he didn't hesitate to volunteer for this transfusion, even with all of its unknowns. So I set up 2 beds at St. John's Hospital, one for Henry, one for Julia. Put a needle in Henry's arm, attached rubber tubing, and attached that rubber tubing to a needle in Julia's arm. Henry's heart pumped blood through the tube into Julia, and it worked. Julia soon got stronger, and I was able to remove the tumor, do the surgery. She got stronger, she got well, and she lived on a healthy, happy life for another 10 years or so. Now, Henry, worked out for Henry too. He had a couple of challenges. Those of you who donate blood know that they generally take about a pint of blood. But I was new to this whole transfusion thing. I thought, well, if a pint is good, more must be better. So we took more than a quart of blood from Henry, and we drained him a little bit dry, starved his brain, and he passed out. But it was okay, because after a day or so in the hospital, forcing fluids and eating nutritious food, he was up and around and just fine. Now, I believe that if we had had a horseshoe sandwich to feed him, he'd have been up and around much faster. But those had not been invented yet. I continued to perform transfusions, and other Springfield docs did as well, but it was always as a last resort. For the next 20 years or so, a successful transfusion depended upon good luck and good timing and community support, because the only way to transfuse blood was directly from one person to another via the rubber tube. So we had to solicit volunteers, large numbers of volunteers, every time we needed a transfusion. It became a common thing for state troopers and members of the American Legion and Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts to give blood as service projects. One of my patients, young Jackie Graff, received over 7 transfusions from state troopers because he was recovering from rheumatic fever. The same week that Jackie got his transfusions, another one of my patients, George Barlow, his kidneys failed after a bout of scarlet fever. George was not as fortunate because he had a rare blood type. And despite the fact that we advertised by radio and newspapers all around the Midwest and generated dozens and dozens of potential donors, we couldn't find one that was suitable for a transfusion for George Barlow. And on June 8th, 1935, at age 15, George Barlow died for want of a pint of blood. Blood transfusions became more prevalent after we figured out how to keep blood from clotting. You know, as soon as blood is out of the body, it coagulates, and you can't transfuse clotted blood. It has to be in liquid form. We discovered that by adding a little bit of citric acid, we could keep blood in liquid form. Now, citric acid is pretty remarkable stuff. In addition to keeping blood fluid, it's also the ingredient that gives the tang in soda pop. If you look at the ingredients on a can of pop, you almost always see citric acid. Citric acid is also the secret ingredient to an especially smooth cheese sauce for your horseshoe sandwich. Before we learned to keep blood fluid with the citric acid trick, doctors experimented with all different kinds of potential replacements for blood. Water was very common, to transfuse water into patients. Doctors thought milk was a pretty healthy fluid, and so they would transfuse milk into people. Messy, and doesn't work. Milk is not a substitute for blood. Doctors experimented with animal to human transfusions. Once here in Springfield, some psychiatrists transfused the blood of a lamb into a violent mental patient. They thought that the blood of the lamb might transfer the gentle personality of the lamb into the mental patient. That didn't work out very well for the lamb or the patient. But the doctors had a delicious lamb chop dinner later. Ba-dum-bum. Might surprise you to learn that animal to human transfusions are viable. Just recently, we've heard about a pig's heart being transplanted into a gentleman. Now, this required a tremendous amount of genetic engineering, whatever that is, because I was a doctor in 1914. I don't know what genetic engineering is. But even in my time, we knew that pig blood and ape blood is sufficiently similar that it can be transfused into human beings with a little bit of pre-processing. Would you accept blood from a pig or an ape? Yeah, I might if I really needed it, but most people have pretty serious misgivings about that. And it's a good thing that we don't have to rely on animal blood for human transfusions, and we don't have to because we figured out how to bank blood. Once we figured out how to bank blood, we no longer had to transfuse blood directly from another person or lamb into our patient. Organized blood donation began in Springfield in 1942, right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and those blood donations were earmarked for the military. I was still practicing medicine in 42 here in Springfield, and I was interviewed by the Illinois State Journal-Register for an article on blood banks, and this is what I said. I said, before blood banks, we had to take blood from the patient needing blood and do tests to determine what type it was. Then we had to test many potential donors to find one with the right type. And this took time. It often took too much time, and the patient died. But with the blood bank, all we have to do is know what type of blood we need. We go to the bank, we withdraw the blood, it's already been typed, and we give the transfusion with no delay. In the meantime, friends and family come forward, volunteering blood. We take all of their blood and store it for future use. Now, today, here in Springfield, our blood bank is called Impact Life. Their main headquarters is over on Wabash. They're not too far from the Dublin pub where you can get a horseshoe sandwich. I hope that all of you will consider donating blood. It's an important thing to do. It does save lives. And if you ever require receiving a blood transfusion, and I pray that you do not, I hope you'll remember this talk and think about those brave pioneers, Henry and Julia, and their very scared doctor, me, Don Deal. Thanks for coming out, and please do consider donating blood. Thank you.